there's a lot of stuff going on right now, and we're kind of in the middle of a big storm. And so I think it's, for me, you could get rid of most economic data and I wouldn't miss it, but there's one piece of information that I always tune into Thursday morning because it is the best measure we have of the pulse of the economy. And what I'm showing you is the number of people who file for unemployment benefits. And I only show it to you now because you want to watch this. This is information through February 15 now. We got this morning. And the reason it's so valuable is because it's covering every single person who has a job in America, no matter whether you work for a small company, a big company, or no matter where you live. You get a snapshot of what's going on in every corner of America by watching this information. And it's been telling you since March of 2009 that we're on the mend, getting back on our feet. And I only mention this because there's a lot of confusion right now. There's a lot of stuff going on. And we want to keep an eye on, we don't know how it's going to play for us. We think we're going to be okay. But what you're watching here is the trend in jobless claims is the lowest we've been seeing since the Ice Age. And what that's telling you is whatever you think about the growth in the economy, we're doing fine, well enough to keep everybody employed. And that's what's so critical about this. It's timely, it's last week's information, it's comprehensive, it's not a sample, it's the actual count of people. And it does a really good job of telling us what's going on relative to the number of people who need jobs, who want jobs. So it's been giving you the best information throughout this whole decade about what's going on. So anyway, what it shows you, what I'm showing you here is the number in thousands of people. So we're running like 210,000 people. That is extremely low. We have a complicated economy. There's a lot of churning and turnover that goes on. And to me, watching this steady trend over the last couple of years is a reminder that we have a lot of, what really dominates the news flow is not all that relevant. It's maybe interesting, but our economy has got a lot of momentum. And there's a lot of shock absorbers in the system, and companies don't lay off people just because you know there's a virus that's going to be disrupting your supply chains. If you know there's something going on that allows you to think that, well, this will be passing and it'll be okay when we get over the hurdle, then you're not going to lay people off because you know, particularly today, everybody's complaining they can't find people. So anyway, just something to keep an eye on as we're going through this storm in the next several months. Now, to me, when it comes to the broad economy, I think we are extremely lucky. We've been dealt a really good hand. And I wouldn't say that if I were reading from the old traditional playbook that we economists tend to look at. We look at where we are in the cycle. This is usually the time when you start getting nervous. But I threw this playbook out the window about 2 decades ago because things began to look different to me than what I had learned in school. And that's why I say I think we're dealing with a really good hand, and I'll sort of explain that in a second. For sure, over the next several months, the news flow is going to be really dominated by the reverberations of the shock in China, the effort to try to contain, to quarantine where the virus is, and Boeing, because they don't have any more room to put planes on airfields, they shut down production of their 737 MAX 8 January 1st. It's a real big deal. Boeing has a huge footprint in the economy. But you know, I really think by spring or early summer, most of the stuff that we're talking about right now is going to be in the rearview mirror. And to me, this is why when you look at economic forecasts today versus where we were 2 months ago, it doesn't look any different. We all know there's some stuff coming through that's going to hit in the first quarter, but we're all expecting this big rebound. And honestly, my Chinese colleagues, this is the story for China. They're claiming China's economy will slow to 0% growth first quarter, bounce back to 10% in the second quarter. I'm not too skeptical of that because any country that can build a hospital in 2 weeks, they got a lot of ability to make things happen. And I think we're going to, when this virus impact is starting to fade, we're going to see an awful lot of a frenzy of activity in the spring. So, and I think same thing going on in the equity market. For a moment, the stock market shivered when people realized that Corona wasn't a beer. And we panicked about what this was going to do, and then just like that, we forgot about it. And here we are yesterday, all-time record highs, which tweets will remind you of every day. To me, I think we're kind of, it's pretty amazing. And I think you might argue, when you hear this happy story from me, you might say, well, this sounds kind of naively optimistic. And if you think that, I think you've got to come to grips with what I'm showing you on this picture. Because this is not something that happened overnight. What I'm showing you here is the value of the U.S. stock market. The scale is a little bit off. I fixed this the other day. The orange line that's moving around is the value of the U.S. stock market. And the blue line is the value of the U.S. economy. And what this thing is telling you, something big is going on. And it didn't happen yesterday. It didn't happen in 2016. This has been going on for a while. I look at this, I'm used to the idea as an economist that the value of the U.S. stock market should be roughly equal to the value of the U.S. economy. And it comes from the idea that, well, after-tax profits of companies have been, until recently, about 6% of GDP. If you think the PEs are 14 to 16 times earnings, that's how you come up with the idea that, well, the value of the U.S. stock market should be roughly equal to the size of the U.S. economy. But that's not happening. And this is the way it was for most of my career, but in the last several years, 7 years, 8 years, the value of the U.S. stock market has risen to about 1.5 times GDP. So you got to ask yourself, what is this about? Some people look at this and they say, well, this looks like a bubble. Interest rates are ridiculously low. We can't make any sense of interest rates where they are. I personally think that there's something fundamental going on. And there are 3 things in particular that have sort of come on the scene, for me, came on the scene about 2 decades ago, that I think is really what's going on here, and that's what I want to talk about. The first thing is that about 20 years ago, I began to notice that the inflation dynamic was looking a lot different than what I learned in school. It was becoming less cyclical. Why this matters is because this picture is showing you the evolution of the U.S. economy from 1945. This is the post-war period. Time starts on the left, you go forward. And what I'm showing you is the unemployment rate upside down. And I've superimposed on that what we economists, the Fed, the Congressional Budget Office, call full employment. The level of unemployment that's consistent with stable inflation. So that's kind of the ideal place you want to be, that solid line that's moving around. It moves around because when the workforce is very young, we hop jobs quickly. We think the next job is going to be better than the one we had. When you're older, you realize it's not so. You got the same baggage. And so what we've learned is that when you have a really young workforce, there's a lot of churning. I see that with my kids, actually. When we get older, we start to realize, the churning tends to slow down. So that little dip there is the baby boom generation coming in. Because everything's upside down here, so when unemployment goes up, the lines are going down, because to me, bad things are when you go down. So what this is telling us is that we have a bad habit of recovering from recession. We get to full employment, that orange line, and then we just never stayed there more than a year or two. That's the old playbook. And that's the reason why people last year were telling you, that's why there was this fascination with recession, because everybody knows when you look at our history books that we have a hard time staying at full employment. You ask people, anyone who's telling you there's going to be a recession, well, you ask them, what are you thinking about? What are you watching that makes you think there's a recession coming? And they'll say, well, nothing really, but I just know it's going to happen. This is what they're referring to. The history book shows you this. The problem is, this is mostly about inflation. And this is why, to me, the inflation dynamic is so key to how you think about what lies ahead. And if you go back and you look at all these moments when the economy got, recovered from recession, got to full employment, invariably what's going on is inflation is starting to move up. The Federal Reserve has to start thinking about not just getting its foot off the gas, but stepping on the brakes. That's always been the problem in all these past cycles. So that's why, to me, inflation is so central. Now, it's not always the case, because a decade ago, the housing debacle is what threw us off course. But most of these old cycles are about inflation dynamics. So here's the thing that's really interesting. If I went to sleep 11 years ago in 2009, and I woke up yet last year, and you told me that I knew where we were in 2009, and you told me that unemployment has come down to the lowest levels since Brian Wilson and Mike Love wrote their song Good Vibrations, 1966. If you told me that the almost 10 million people who were truly unemployed, young adults, people who are working part-time, they don't show up in the unemployment statistics. If you told me that whole problem had gone away, and you told me that wages are growing about 3%, which is not unreasonable given the fundamentals, and you told me that the main complaint that companies have today is they can't find people. They can't find people for the jobs they've got. And at the same time, you told me, oh, by the way, the Fed just cut rates because it wanted a little more insurance with unemployment at 3.5%. The last thing on my mind would be that I should be worrying about recession. And that's why when I heard all this conversation last year, it just made no sense to me. And by the way, for those who care, inverted treasury yield curves in the era of QE are bogus. It's a bogus way to think about what's going on, even though it dominates the conversation on Wall Street, or it did last year. So to me, the implication here, why it goes back to that first chart, if you think that recession is not in the cards, not anytime soon yet, we don't see things yet that should make us worry about this, or you think we're in the 11th inning of the third game of the 2018 World Series, the only game the Dodgers won in 18 innings, if you think that's the case, as I do, then the multiple in the stock market ought to be higher than normal when you're in a place where we are, full employment. And I think that's the multiple is generous, but it's not ridiculous. It's not like where we were back in the 1990s with the dot-com speculation. Now, second, there's something really big and disruptive going on to me in the economy. And to me, it's kind of, I see it in the way income gets divvied up between how much goes to profits, how much goes to workers, and what you're seeing is just staggering, frankly. Now, what I'm showing you here is the share of income that goes to profits. Historically, after-tax profits were about 6% of GDP, but really beginning sometime in the late 1990s, something new began to happen. It wasn't real obvious at first because we had a couple cycles that kind of throw things off. But the after-tax profits as a share of GDP have moved up to about 9% to 10%. And this is despite some of the stresses going on right now. The energy sector, the financial sector with interest rates ridiculously low, Boeing's issues, all of those are dampening this. But as you might know, the flip side of this is the share going to workers, not so much. So the share of it's been going to workers has been drifting down also. And why this matters is because we know in the equity market, if you put these two together and you just look at the share going to workers, the share going to profits, when you put it together, we know that these shares move around over the course of the business cycle. So in the equity market, people tend to think that, well, when things get out of line, everything normalizes. Eventually everything normalizes. And so that was a reasonable thought until maybe the last several years, you're starting to notice that things aren't normalizing. that the share going to profits is still relatively high. The share going to workers has recovered a little bit, but it's not normalizing like people thought. And you've got unemployment at 3.5%. It doesn't get better. It doesn't get better. I mean, it could, but probably won't. So what that means is, I think what's going on is the equity market, equity investors are beginning to realize that there's something different here that's going on, something structural maybe. And I think, to me, the way you see that, it's about two things, and you won't be surprised to hear. It's about two things. It's innovation and globalization. If you worked on globalization, if the first guys that saw this might have been the guys that worked in the auto plant, the robots. The next guys that saw it are the people that work in the malls, Amazon Prime. The other people that see this are the folks who are in the taxi business, Uber, Lyft. And to me, the way that I visualize what innovation is doing, innovation is a wonderful thing. It's what lifts our living standard. It's what makes us be able to do things more efficiently, but it's extremely disruptive. We've been living with this for a long time. For example, when I was a kid, this ages me, when I was a kid, you get in an elevator, a human being used to operate the elevator. That job doesn't, so this kind of stuff's going on all the time. The problem is, there's something new about what's going on right now. And trying to get and the way I see it playing into the economic trends and why it's driving the political debate is, if you look at this picture, this is a picture that I never was told about in school. We always learn that when companies invest in tools and equipment to make us more productive, if I'm more productive, I'm going to get better pay. And so we always knew as economists, if you're trying to understand what's going on with real hourly compensation, you follow the trends in labor productivity. And the picture that I always thought was, this is what happens in modern mature economies, is labor productivity and real hourly pay tend to line up. If they don't, that's going to be messing up with the distribution of income. Well, if you look what's going on here, and this began to emerge in the late 1990s, the trend in labor productivity kept going up, and real hourly pay began to slow down. And I think, to me, this is all about, this is about technology. What's happening is innovation is displacing routine work. And so more and more of the economic value of what humans used to do is being diverted into things that go into profits. So what it's telling you is there's a big change, there's a big transformation going on in our economy. It's a wonderful thing for young people because you've got time to figure out where are the new opportunities, you get the skills, there's a lot of opportunity that comes with this. But if you're in your 40s and 50s, it's a nightmare because something happened in the factory and it's not China that took your job, it's the robot that took your job. And it's very difficult if you're 45, 50 to rationalize reinvesting in skills that you might only use for the remaining years of your life. So you can sort of understand, to me, this is sort of the story that explains the political divide that's going on and the reason why it's not a surprise that it's the industrial footprint where a lot of this frustration with what's going on is happening. So to me, what's going on in innovation is really a big part of the story. And I think the thing to know about this is it's not Amazon's fault. It's not Uber's fault. It's your fault and my fault because we use the stuff. So nobody's making me do one click on the phone to save myself 4 hours at the mall. But what it's telling you is all the innovation that's happening, it's happening because everything's gone mobile. So when people come up with clever ideas, it can happen really dramatically and dramatically change a lot of our industries. And it's you and I, it's because of the benefits that this innovation is bringing that we embrace it. So it's you and I that are using it. If Amazon invented this stuff, Amazon Prime or Uber, and we didn't use it, nothing would happen. But the fact that we're using it is telling you that there's huge benefits that we enjoy. And we're the ones driving it, and so it's not going away. This is something that's not going to change. So I think I think what's going on in the equity market is as you see the profit share not normalizing, I think people have started to realize there actually is something powerful here going on, something structural. And if you think we're in the pregame of this story, as Michael Dell tells you, then I think people are starting to realize there's more going on here. It's going to be a while before we start to see things start to normalize. Now, the second thing is globalization. To me, when you think about that first picture I showed you, or the second picture, the value of the U.S. stock market versus the value of the U.S. economy, I think what we're learning is the world is no longer just about the U.S. economy for American businesses. What's happening is the world around us is waking up and wants to go to work. And what's driving it, the reason they're doing this is because they're tired of being poor. The internet opened people's eyes to the way we all live. And it's not, when a thing like this is going on, there are going to be a lot of things to complain about, a lot of violations of intellectual property rights, things like that. But to me, the thing that's really driving this story that's going on is that countries have realized they want something else. They want to develop. And the way to do it is to open your borders to outsiders. And so our businesses are increasingly becoming involved in what's going on around us. And I think what that tells you is the reason the value of the U.S. stock market may be moving much further than the U.S. economy is because the marketplace is expanding beyond our shores. Our companies are involved in what's going on. So the GPS that I use to try to figure out what lies ahead is this picture, which tells you the living standard of each of the 195 countries around the world relative to the U.S. level. If you're up to that line that's 1, that means you're living like the U.S. Your living standard is like the U.S. There's a handful of countries here on the left. They have a lot of oil and a few cows. I mean, that's about it. But if you look at most people, take a look at China. China's GDP is about equal to the U.S., but they have 5 times the people. So what that means is China's living standard, using the IMF numbers for GDP, they're 20% of the U.S. level. India, even more. So what that tells you is, I think we know where these countries want to go. They want our help. Our companies are happy to be there. Half of my clients, they're business owners of small and mid-sized businesses. Half of them are getting revenues from abroad. That was not the way it was 10 years ago. And that tells you the world's gotten bigger. We're all participating. And the real message in all of this is, if you help others get on their feet, you'll help ourselves too. And I think that's the story that's sort of playing through that's really why the U.S. that's that picture of the U.S. stock market versus U.S. GDP. That's the way to understand this. It tells you something big is going on. Now, to me, here's the fascinating thing. In a few minutes, Bill is going to come up here and he's going to give you an update on the fiscal outlook. My guess is he's going to come up here and want to tear my speech up. Yeah? And I think you might leave this panel wondering, how can the U.S. economy be in such good shape, but the fiscal picture be so dire? How can it be so bad? I think it's important to understand this, because the truth is, economics is as much a part of the story as taxes and spending. And I think the thing to remember is, we've done a really good job. We're back on our feet. The U.S. economy is great because everybody's got a job that wants a job, pretty much. But the problem is, we're learning that although we're back on our feet, back to full employment, we're learning that we're not growing as fast. Our mojo has slowed down because of our demographics. And what I'm showing you here is the number of people who are working age, 16 to 70 years of age. Until about 10 years ago, there were 200,000 people every year in the U.S. That population was growing 200,000 a month. Now it has slowed down to almost 50,000 a month. What that tells you is our natural growth rate has slowed down. That's how we got the economy back to full employment, even though we didn't grow very quickly. And this is the fundamental story that's really going on in the minds of the CBO. So the CBO reasonably has to assume that something's changed. The U.S. economy is not growing as fast as it used to be. And this is what they're assuming, and this is why it matters. What they're assuming is, if you look at the last century, we grew about 3.5%. If you look at what they're having to assume from here to eternity, they're assuming we're going to be growing about 1.75%. If our economy, if we have all these promises we've made from an era where we were growing 3.5%, and then we slow down in half, there's no way we're going to be able to get generate the revenues to pay for this stuff. So what it tells you is, if you think the answer to the budget deficit is to cut spending, raise taxes, we'll probably find out that it does more harm than good. The smart answer is figure out how to get more energy in the U.S. economy. And what I mean by that is things like immigration reform, so we get people into those 7 million jobs we can't fill. Smarter technology for improving the flow of goods and people over the transportation network. Pro-growth kinds of initiatives. Manage our healthcare resources better. Those are the kinds of things that we should be doing. And I think, honestly, for Bill, I think this is the reason you're not hearing a lot of people worry about the budget deficit, because not only is interest rates historically low, we think there might be a smarter way to get out of this hole that we're in. And I think that's why you're not hearing much conversation about this. So pay attention to what Bill has to say. It's important. We do have to figure out how to solve the problem, but don't tear up my speech.